Welcome, and thank you for attending the Sutherland webinar, Understanding the Georgia Manufacturing Exemptions, hosted by Sutherland attorneys Jonathan Feldman and Scott Wright. Should you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them via the question and answer chat box on your viewing console. I will now turn you over to Jonathan Feldman.
Hello, good morning, and thanks to everyone for joining this webinar today. I'm Jonathan Feldman, and we'll be presenting today along with Scott Wright. We're both partners in the Sutherland Asbill Atlanta office, and we certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group about sales and use taxation of manufacturers in Georgia. Before getting into the nuts and bolts of the law as it stands today regarding the manufacturing exemption, we thought that we could provide some additional insight by walking through the recent history of sales and use taxation of manufacturers in Georgia, which will give everyone a better understanding of where the law stands today by knowing where we came from. Previously, Georgia had one of the most restrictive manufacturing exemptions in both the Southeast and the country, both by the letter of the law and by the Department's application of the law. However, through the hard work of many, including both the Georgia Mining Association and the Georgia Association of Manufacturers, and through the personal efforts of Lee Lemke and Roy Bowen and Clay Jones from both the legislative side and from working with the Department of Revenue in developing interpretive regulations, we think Georgia now has one of the most generous and broad manufacturing exemptions in the country, and certainly in the Southeast, competitive with all our neighbor states. After walking through the history of the manufacturing exemption, we will walk through the who, what, and where of manufacturing in Georgia and how the law and the regulations interpret specific terms as defined in the law. And we will conclude by focusing on the current status of the taxation of energy used by manufacturers. I believe with this webinar, everyone has the ability to submit questions to Scott and I, and we do encourage you to do so at any time during the presentation. We'll try to address the questions either as they come in or at the end. So please do submit questions, and we are happy to answer those. And those will perhaps focus us on an issue that we don't have in the slides. And with that, we'll turn it over to Scott Wright to start our discussion of the history of the manufacturing exemption in Georgia.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. This is Scott Wright. Good morning, everyone. As Jonathan alluded to, you really can't understand how great we have it now with the manufacturing exemption in Georgia, and what great work that the associations did in getting the legislature to pass this without looking at the history of the Georgia manufacturing exemption, where we came from. Prior to the 2009 changes, Georgia was really one of the more restrictive states. States in manufacturing exemptions fall along a continuum. There's a lot of variation in state manufacturing exemptions from sales tax. And on the two ends, you generally have those states that require property or manufacturing machinery to be directly used in the manufacturing process, very closely associated with the manufacturing line, versus what we have today, the integrated plant type of state, where it has to be integrated and necessary to the manufacturing. Really, if it is necessary to the manufacturing, if the manufacturer uses it, you're going to be exempt. Previously, and what we had, and this is, again, old law, don't be confused, we're looking at this to just show how bad it used to be and what the changes have been. Georgia was in that camp of so-called direct use states. You can see the statutory language there on this slide. In order to be exempt, the machinery had to be used directly in the manufacture of tangible personal property, and it had to be bought to replace or upgrade machinery in the manufacturing plant. You can read through the rest of that. But what that generally required was a whole set of requirements The first of which is that the machinery must be used directly in the manufacture of tangible personal property. It didn't matter that it was absolutely necessary for the process, but it actually had to exert physical force on the manufactured item itself. It had to almost in most every instance, touch the product in some way as it was being manufactured. And if it did not, then there was definitely going to be an issue on audit from the Georgia Department of Revenue. I'll give you a couple of examples on that, just so so that we know how bad it was. So in manufacturing plants, you often have boilers that are connected to clear machines that are operating on the production line. Those boilers power those machines and provide steam and other useful materials to the machines. But the Department of Revenue, in most instances, would say that those boilers were not directly used in the process. It was a separate loop. It wasn't directly touching the raw materials as they went through the manufacturing process, and they would often deny exemption on those boilers as indirect property that was not directly used in the manufacture of tangible personal property. You know, one more example, there were lots of cases in Georgia. This certainly spawned a whole lot of litigation. And one of the more interesting ones, and to see just how direct you had to be, was one dealing with the manufacture of copper. In that process, the manufacturer has to actually, it's an electrolytic process, meaning they actually have to shoot electricity into the material that will then, the electrocution of it will then create changes in it and change the copper anodes to the form in which they are sold. So you had to actually shoot electricity into the raw material. And what was at issue were the machines that were generating, that were actually performing that function of shooting the electricity into the product. The court holds, believe it or not, that was indirect, that machinery used to shoot the electricity into the raw material was not directly used in the manufacturing process because there was an intervening agency. The electricity itself was what was causing the change in the product, and that electricity, even though created by the machinery that the taxpayer was trying to be exempted, was an intervening agency and making that machinery indirect property and not exempt under the old directly used manufacturing exemption. So lots of issues about whether something was directly used or not. There were also other requirements that the department would and their agents, their auditors would choose from to deny deductions in this older period. One of those relates to how they were defining machinery. The machinery was defined as an assemblage of parts that transmits force, motion, and energy in a predetermined manner to accomplish specific objectives. But believe it or not, for a long period of time, the parts, if you had to replace a part of the machine or machinery, those were not exempt because they were not an assemblage of parts, they were parts. This, of course, spawned a lot of litigation. There was really no exemption for repair or replacement parts up until 1994. Then the statute was changed to supposedly exempt repair and replacement parts, but the courts interpreted it very narrowly, as they have done, as they did in this whole exemption, even though we thought very much intended to exempt repair and replacement parts. The courts came out and said, no, it has to, in order for the replacement part to be exempt, it would have to upgrade the machinery. You'd have to show some increase in the productive capacity of the machinery in order to claim the exemption. That, of course, was not workable and not a favorable provision for taxpayers. And so more lobbying work was done, and the legislature finally chose to actually exempt repairs and phased it in over a 4-year period, starting in 2001. So for a long time, those were not exempt, and then they were, again, marching toward this big change in Georgia law to exempt pretty much much more material. It had to be, oftentimes the department would look to draw lines between, it had to be used during the manufacturing process itself, and so they would determine when the manufacturing began and when it ended, and so the machinery had to be used between those 2 points. In addition, it couldn't be a separate and direct loop out of that. Had some issues there with the mining industry, actually. There was a lot of litigation over when does the manufacturing process start for quarrying companies that dig aggregate out of the ground and then send it through clear manufacturing processes of crushing the material to smaller sizes and so forth, and then into other changes in the form. The courts came out and said that for those entities, those companies, the manufacturing process would begin at that first crushing machine. So they were always trying to find when manufacturing began, when it ended. There were also issues about whether the property was used at a fixed location, and this was subject of a lot of litigation. The Department of Revenue auditors would often claim that any type of movable property was not used at a fixed location and would not qualify. So all of these issues really generated a lot of disputes with the Department of Revenue on audit and even in litigation. And when they got to litigation, the courts were very narrowly construed the old direct use exemption. They construed it under the standard that all exemptions, since it is an exemption from tax, it must be narrowly construed, and it will not apply unless clearly covers the situation at hand. And more often than not, the court would determine that it was not, that particular property was not exempt. Now, this very narrow exemption in Georgia certainly affected Georgia's ability to attract and retain manufacturing companies. It was a problem for the economic development of Georgia. On the one hand, there was supposedly a manufacturing exemption, but it really wasn't widely applied, only applied to very specific property. It was a huge audit issue all the time, and manufacturers were under constant audit in Georgia because there were always disagreements about what was exempt and what was not. So just to kind of recap and go through some of the items under the prior law and how they were generally treated, kind of summarize where we were at prior to the efforts to go to the integrated plant exemption. So going through this list with you have catwalks that were mandated. You absolutely could not manufacture your product without these catwalks because the law mandated that you have them. Didn't matter that they're absolutely necessary. Department of Revenue said they are not exempt because they're not directly used in the manufacturing. Chillers and boilers, we already talked about. They supported the manufacturing process, and they're absolutely necessary again, but they were not directly used. Cooling towers, same thing. You had a lot of issues about machinery that you were using to internally manufacture other machines and parts, or even industrial materials that could be used in your process. The department would look at that and either say it wasn't directly used in the manufacture of the property for sale, and sometimes even focus on that for sale requirement. If it was manufacturing a material you were using in the process but not being retained in the process, that was not, from their view, property used, produced for sale. Forklifts were often denied because they weren't used at a fixed location, even though you absolutely had to have the forklifts to move items around. Tools and spare parts. We talked about the spare parts. Tools, the prior exemption only did not cover equipment separate from machinery, and so the department, any type of tool or tooling and tools that were not themselves machinery, but clearly equipment that was necessary, was still not exempt. Safety equipment, even though you had to have it by law, as we said, was not directly used and therefore was not exempt. Conveyor belts end up here. The department had to draw all sorts of lines, and obviously conveyor belts so necessary in the production line, and if it was for carrying the property you're producing between exempt manufacturing machinery, the department would exempt it. But if it was going to sending the product to storage or bringing the product from delivery to the plant to the first manufacturing location at the plant, then the department would deny it. So they were having to draw all sorts of lines, and it's not favorable for anybody. It wasn't favorable for industry, certainly. Even the department at some levels, would complain about it because it took so much time. And I think it certainly kept some lawyers busy, kept some in the Attorney General's office actually busy full time on litigating these types of manufacturing machinery cases. So not a good state of affairs. And so, Jonathan, tell us how we got out of that.
Well, I mean, the words hallelujah kind of pop into my head with the changes that we had in 2009. So in 2008, the legislature made some changes that became effective January 1st, 2009. At that point, we moved away we repealed the old direct use type position and went to the integrated plant legislation, which is on the spectrum of least restrictive to most broadest manufacturing exemption. The integrated plant really is the broadest type of manufacturing exemption, and that's what Georgia moved to in 2009 as a result of a lot of lobbying efforts by the associations and other folks. So under the integrated plant concept, rather than requiring that the machinery be used directly in the manufacture of tangible personal property, the exemption now applies to both machinery and equipment that simply needs to be necessary and integral to the manufacture of tangible personal property. So it doesn't have to be directly used or directly touching the items, the industrial materials, the raw materials that are being converted from raw materials to a finished product. It just needs to be necessary and integral to that process. So all sorts of chillers and coolers and air conditioning and water conditioning and conveyor belts and forklifts and all sorts of things that are used in the manufacturing process and important to the manufacturing process, but not necessarily converting the materials from raw materials to finished product. All those things became exempt based on the legislative change, House Bill 237, that became effective in 2009. And really, this was a result of Georgia trying to remain competitive with our southeastern neighbors in attracting manufacturing business, which, of course, provide a lot of jobs and a lot of benefits to the state and both the local communities that they're in. So this change brought Georgia in line with what was already the majority rule in the southeast and allowed Georgia to compete for those manufacturing businesses. And it was also, from a tax policy perspective, really important concept in tax policies to try to avoid sales tax pyramiding, which happens when taxes apply to each stage of the manufacturing process rather than just to the end use. And when you have tax pyramiding, you really have that tax on tax situation where instead of just a simple 8% tax on the finished product, because there's tax on each phase of the manufacturing process, you really had more than an 8% or whatever the relevant sales tax rate was on finished goods. And so this helped from a tax policy perspective. Is really more faithful to the concept of only taxing the ultimate consumer. And, of course, it helped promote efficient tax administration. And Scott referenced the long and difficult department audits that manufacturers were having, and that was leading to extended litigation on all sorts of issues under direct use. In fact, interesting concept, some of the attorneys that worked for the Attorney General office in Georgia, when we went from direct use to integrated plant, were saying, well, what am I going to do now? I'm not going to have any more cases to litigate. And so, of course, that's good for the manufacturing community, that there's less controversy, less time dealing with auditors and audits, and more time to spend running your business. Exactly what changed in 2009, I mean, the extent of the words that changed wasn't that big, but what words changed is what's important. And so if you look on this slide, so before only machinery was exempt, but now equipment became exempt, which is very important because, you know, machinery is just an assemblage of parts, but equipment is really anything, any tangible property other than machinery, like catwalks, like a hammer or a screwdriver, most sort of tangible personal property that's not machinery generally would fall under equipment, unless it was deemed to be a consumable supply, which we'll get to the treatment of that. And instead of the used directly requirement, that became, I don't know, this slide, it's a little bit different than I guess what I printed out, but the used directly is crossed out, and instead of used directly, necessary and integral became the requirement rather than the used directly requirement.
You go ahead. I'm sorry.
You can go to the next slide. So, you know, three main changes to the exemption statute when we went from direct use to integrated plant. We added the equipment. Equipment could be exempt and not just machinery, which really broadened the statute quite a bit. We added, removed the directly used requirement and replaced that with the necessary integral language. And we also removed the requirement that machinery or equipment be incorporated into a manufacturing plant. And that allowed the exemption to be used for all sorts of mobile machinery and handheld tools, like screwdrivers and wrenches, also like forklifts or pallet jacks or any sort of machinery or equipment that is moved around a manufacturing plant. It no longer has to be incorporated or screwed, you know, into a fixed location in the plant. If it's movable in the plant, as of 2009, the exemption became available. Then the next statutory change came in 2012, and this was part of a larger tax bill that was based on recommendations of the Georgia Tax Reform Committee. And this bill continued to expand the manufacturing exemption in Georgia. Probably most importantly for the folks on this webinar, it began the phase-out of tax on energy used by manufacturers. Scott will get into the details of the taxation of energy in a little bit, but this was a crucial change to compete with the other southeastern states that already had a full or partial exemption for energy, and allowed Georgia to compete on a cost that I think we heard was either the first or second largest cost of all the manufacturers in Georgia. In fact, this bill was so important. Just last week in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, there was an article that was talking about how the flooring business has recently been flourishing in Georgia, and there's lots of new manufacturing plants that have been broken ground recently or have been announced recently. And the governor is quoted in the article that's crediting House Bill 386 and the phase-out of the exemption of energy for the growth of the flooring industry in Georgia. And the phase-out of energy is not the only thing that House Bill 386 did. One of the things that it did is there used to be separate exemptions for machinery and equipment one for industrial materials and one for packaging supplies. What this bill did was it consolidated them all into one single exemption, which really made it much easier to follow the law. Another really important thing that this bill did was incorporate the language from the regulation. If you go back to 2009, when integrated plant was enacted, the department had to develop some regulations to interpret the new integrated plant statute. And so there was a lot of feedback and cooperation between the department and industry, and we all worked together to develop a pretty extensive regulation, 15 or 20-page regulation to interpret the statutory language. And it was language that I think most of the folks in the manufacturing community were pretty comfortable with. Well, it was great language, but of course it was only in the regulation. And so if you do get into a legal dispute, of course the statutory language would always trump a regulation. Well, what House Bill 386 did is, for the most part, it took that regulatory language and put it into the statute, which was, it's very favorable for taxpayers to have that great language now into the statute. And in doing so, it included the list of examples of items which generally do qualify for the manufacturing exemption, but the statute excluded the list of examples of items that do not qualify for the manufacturing exemption. And this may seem like a subtle point, but it is very helpful. If a taxpayer wants to argue against an example in the regulation of something that's not exempt, because the legislature did not adopt those examples, there is a position that you could say, well, the legislature knew the department's position on what's taxable and what's not taxable, but they decided not to incorporate all the taxable items in the statute. You could argue that the legislature did that purposely, and maybe they didn't agree with the list of taxable items in the regulation. So that is a kind of important distinction that came about as a result of House Bill 386.
So, Jonathan, on that point, I mean, certainly the Department of Revenue, if they have it in their regulation that it's subject to tax, they're going to take that position on audit. But this leaves open the possibility, I mean, if you have enough at stake, if it's an important enough issue for you or your industry, then there is some potential for even challenging those examples in the regulation that say something else.
Yeah, absolutely. But you probably need to challenge it through litigation, but the opportunity is there that you could potentially prevail. And then the last statutory change that we're going to talk about is one that just happened this year. And this is one that became effective July 1, 2014. And so this one could have an effect on third quarter earnings to the extent that there are any additional cost savings from the expansion of the exemption. And what happened in House Bill 900 that the legislature passed earlier this year, now effective as of the beginning of this month, is now consumable supplies are now exempt in Georgia, when previously they were taxable. And there's a kind of an interesting history to, you would say, well, why were consumable supplies ever taxable? Shouldn't they have been exempt like machinery, like equipment? Well, really, you'd have to think through the history. Originally, when consumable supplies were excluded from the exemption, it's because energy was deemed to be a consumable supply. And because energy was taxable and such a big part of the tax base in Georgia, they couldn't have exempted consumable supplies. But after House Bill 386 in 2012, now that energy is treated separately from consumable supplies, now you had consumable supplies sitting out there by itself as taxable, and there really wasn't any policy reason why, at this point, consumable supplies should be treated any differently than other machinery and equipment. And additionally, from a fiscal revenue standpoint, when this was analyzed by the legislature, they determined that they couldn't determine or calculate what the fiscal impact of adding consumable supplies for the exemption was. So when this bill was proposed and passed, there actually wasn't a fiscal note attached to it. So For the most part, the department and the economists that helped with this legislation didn't believe that there would be a huge fiscal impact or a huge revenue cost by adding consumables to the exemption. And the Department of Revenue is currently revisiting the regulation that's out there to account for this change in consumable supplies. There was a regulatory hearing on this issue a couple weeks ago. We believe the department's going to change a little bit their proposed language regarding consumable supplies, and we should have a final regulation probably in the next couple of months.
You know, Jonathan, we're going to get into some examples of what are consumable supplies and so forth. But one point why that was so important, even though the department may not have scored it as a lot, there were some ongoing disputes about particular consumables that should no longer be a problem. One of the biggest ones on audit that we had seen were chemicals used in the pollution control process. And so at least to the extent of those, the addition of consumables as exempt made a huge difference, even though it might not have been enough for the department to score it heavily. So there are the integrated plant exemption does still have some requirements, and so we're going to go through kind of the who, what, and where of manufacturing, and that really decides whether the exemption applies. As Jonathan has been alluding to, it's extremely broad. The first requirement is that you in fact be a manufacturer. Those companies that are not manufacturers are not entitled to the exemption. You have to kind of dig through the language and the statute and the regulations to get to that, but the manufacturer of tangible personal property is defined as must take place at a manufacturing plant, and manufacturing plant is defined as a place where a manufacturer engages in its activities, and so you must be a manufacturer in Georgia to benefit from the machinery and equipment exemption. A person or business or a location, that doesn't mean that the whole company has to be engaged in manufacturing. You can actually have a particular location that is qualified as a manufacturer, even though your company as a whole may not itself be considered a manufacturing company. The requirement is laid out in the statute and regulations based on what the classification of the company or the location, the facility, is under the North American Industrial Classification System, the so-called NAICS or NAICS code for the facility. And it actually lists particular numbers. And if your company or your location of your company falls within that description, those NAICS codes, then one of those NAICS codes, then you would be considered a manufacturer. Or even if you did not fall within one of those particular classification codes, you could still make an argument that you're generally regarded as being a manufacturer. So there's an out. Two-step process. You first look to whether you qualify under one of those NAICS classifications, and if not, you can still argue perhaps that you are generally regarded as a manufacturer. Those NAICS codes that qualify are listed in the statute as they're listed here on this slide. What they pertain to is, 21 includes the mining, quarrying, and quarrying industry. The sector 31 are food, tobacco, textile manufacturers. Sector 32 deals with other manufacturers for wood and forest products, printing, asphalt and concrete, and chemical manufacturing. 33 deals with all sorts of metals manufacturers. And then these more specific codes, they added for various reasons at the time of the statute. This 22-111 actually deals with power generators. The companies that generate electric power for sale are considered manufacturers, and those generating plants regardless of whether they're hydroelectric, whether they burn fossil fuels or nuclear or create nuclear power. Those generators are considered manufacturers under the machinery exemption. We'll get to one exception to that, but by and large, power generators like Georgia Power and Oglethorpe Power, they are considered manufacturers under this exemption. Now, there's one exception that have to be under the definition of manufacturer that everyone has to be aware of that can trip up some companies, because businesses that are primarily engaged in providing personal or professional services or in the operation of retail outlets, generally including grocery stores and bakeries and restaurants, are not considered manufacturers. That was an important piece for the Department of Revenue at the time the regulation was originally drafted, and then that got put into the statute revisions themselves. The restaurants are certainly have machinery in their equipment, or machinery equipment in their kitchens that are making changes to food products and could be considered manufacturing in some states, but in Georgia it is not, and the things to pay attention to are also bakeries. I mean, the Publix bakery at the grocery store is not going to have an exemption, but if they had a separate site with a bakery that then trucked in the baked goods to Publix, then they could potentially be considered a manufacturer and exempt from tax. I always think about Krispy Kreme, actually, when I think about here, where the Krispy Kreme donut location that has where they're actually making the donuts and they're selling the donuts is not exempt as a manufacturer. If they had a separate location and trucked those donuts around, they could potentially have a manufacturing exemption.
Yeah, of course you wouldn't get those great smells that makes you want to buy donuts and bread. So
right. Generating sales much more important generally than, or can be more important than some sales tax exemptions. But the first requirement has to be a manufacturer. The other where requirement, where does the manufacturing have to take place? There was a lot of back and forth about these requirements of how to define a manufacturing plant, the place where manufacturing takes place, until the department decided that under the original regulation that, well, it just means any place, any facility or site where a manufacturer engages in the manufacture of tangible personal property. You might think that's not very helpful, but actually it's an extremely helpful provision that industry got from the Department of Revenue originally, and now is in the statute. It does so you no longer even if you have particular locations that only some portion of it could be considered manufacturing, that portion can still be considered a manufacturing plant. The caveat is what we were just talking about, the exception with retail outlets. But if you have say a distribution facility, that all it is a distribution facility, but on some portion of that you are doing some additional changing of the property, that machinery used in the distribution facility can still be considered manufacturing machinery, because it is, in fact, that portion of that distribution facility could be considered a manufacturing plant. The other kind of issue that this took care of, again, is very, very broad where a manufacturing plant can be, is the whole argument that you used to have under the direct use exemption, that the department would sometimes argue that mobile equipment did not qualify if it wasn't at an established fixed site for the manufacturing. And so here, if any site where manufacturing takes place is considered a manufacturing plant, even mobile equipment that is used to manufacture property for sale can be exempt from tax.
And now we'll move into the what. So what is machinery? And machinery is still basically defined as an assemblage of parts that transmits force, motion, and energy basically to make the product. But as Scott has said, machinery is the assemblage of parts, but of course now it's very clear that it's also the parts itself. And we've got a list of parts here that are deemed to be component parts of machinery. And so the machinery is the whole assemblage of parts and the parts itself. And one of the interesting pieces here, I'll touch on a couple of them, is repair and replacement parts. And that, since the integrated plant became effective in 2009, repair and replacement parts were exempt, and of course we had the statutory phase-in of repair and replacement parts before that. But repair and replacement parts doesn't just include gauge and gaskets and pulleys and blades. Ever since 2009, repair and replacement parts has also included liquid replacement parts. That could be oils and greases or any sort of part that's used in a machine. There was a lot of discussion between the taxpayers and the department of how do you treat repair and replacement parts. Should they be deemed consumable supplies, or could they be something else? And what was decided and agreed by the department was really, you've got, if a blade is a replacement part and it's used over a period of time and it's used up and it has to be replaced, there's really no difference between oils and greases and other liquid replacement parts. It's really, you put them in, they're new over time, they're used up, and you have to replace them. And so, even back to 2009, oils and greases that are used in a machine have been exempt. And another one I want to touch on here, operational structures attached to the machine, including stairways and catwalks. Of course, those were not exempt under direct use, but now if those are deemed to be necessary and integral to the manufacturing process, those would be exempt. One thing to keep in mind is we are talking here, the exemption only applies to tangible personal property. So if any of these could be classified as real property rather than tangible personal property, there may be some difficulty. And so you always want to keep in mind that we're only talking about tangible personal property here. Equipment. What is equipment? Well, I really think of today as equipment is all tangible personal property other than machinery, which is an assemblage of parts and the parts, other than industrial materials, which are the raw materials that you're making into finished product. And previously, you had to exclude consumable supplies from equipment, but as of July 1, 2014, now consumable supplies are treated as part of equipment. So today, equipment is really everything other than machinery and industrial materials. And we put a list of what is equipment, what we believe are what examples of equipment are: machinery, clothing, cones, cores, pallets, hand tools, tooling, molds, dyes, waxes, jigs, patterns, conveyors, safety devices, pollution control devices. I guess some of these you could also qualify as machinery, but that'd be okay. They'd be exempt as well. Perhaps some of these, if today you want to qualify or classify some of these as consumable supplies, that's okay, because consumable supplies are considered equipment anyways. And so really, machinery or equipment, it really doesn't matter that much how you classify them today, because either way, they should be exempt. And so effective July 2014, consumable supplies are now exempt. And we've got a question, and I often think of, and even when we were working on the legislation, I was trying to figure out what are consumable supplies. If there was no fiscal note associated with bill, then how do we know what consumable supplies are, and how do we know how much they cost? And in fact, one of the problems with taxing consumable supplies previously was taxpayers weren't sure what consumable supplies were, and so they didn't know whether something was packaging or was it a liquid repair part, or whether it was a consumable supply or not, so they weren't sure how to treat it. In fact, the department admitted that, from policy all the way down to the auditors, they weren't sure what consumable supplies were, so they didn't exactly know what to look for. They were spending a lot of time looking for something that they weren't sure what they were looking for. Well, we've tried in this slide to at least define what consumable supplies are and give some examples. So consumable supplies, we believe, and this is coming from the statute, tangible personal property that is readily disposable or consumed or expended during the manufacturing process. There perhaps is some question about how you look at consumed or expended. In the regulation, as it's worded today, it has the word immediately consumed or expended. Well, what's immediately? And does it have to be right away, or can it be an hour later? I would expect that when the revised regulation comes out, the word immediately is removed, so we didn't put it in here. So I think it just has to be consumed or expended during the manufacturing process in order to be exempt. And the manufacturing process is pretty broad. It includes packaging process. It includes pollution control. And so if you're using a consumable supply during packaging, during pollution control, we think that should be exempt today. One example we have is chemicals used in water treatment or pollution control devices. Pollution control is part of the manufacturing process, so those should be exempt. Another item, perhaps, that could be a change is there's companies that in their pollution control process they use bacteria to eat up certain bad byproduct of the manufacturing process, and before all living organisms were taxable, but because consumable supplies are now exempt, and we think that bacteria used in pollution control process, we think those are consumable supplies. We expect the department will change the regulation regarding those. Some other examples of what consumable supplies are: tape, swabs, cups, sticks, bags, paper towels, anything that you use once or twice and is disposable. And also welding gases, that's not considered to be a fuel source. Of course, fuel is exempt as energy, but it'd be subject to the phase-out. So if you're using a welding gas and it's not fuel, it should be 100% exempt today. If you're using a welding gas and it's deemed to be fuel, it'd be subject to the phase-out.
Hey, Jonathan, I know we're going to go through a lot of examples here in just a few slides, but while we're on this consumable supply point, what do you think about a light bulb that is used on a machine, where so you have to be able to see what you're doing, the operator of the machine has to be able to see what they're doing, and so there's a light bulb on the machine to light the area. What do you think about that?
Yeah, previously I would have taken the position that the light bulb was safety equipment because the product, the manufacturing process couldn't be done safely without the light. It's not part of the real property because it's attached to the machine, so it is tangible personal property. And even before consumables were exempt, all safety equipment was exempt, whether it was a consumable or not. Now that light bulb, now consumables are exempt, I would argue it's either safety equipment or a consumable supply. I'd make the argument that it's exempt today.
Exempt today, and it was exempt
right
as soon as the integrated plant statute came into place.
Yeah.
Good.
And we have a question about some packaging supplies, dunnage that's used in shipping. I would also take maybe a similar position. Packaging supplies have always been exempt. 2009, even prior to that, packaging supplies were exempt. And so if you're using something in packaging, you could either argue that it's a packaging supply and it is exempt, or perhaps even if it's not deemed to be a packaging supply, you could argue it's now a consumable supply. So I think there's some positions that something used in shipping, such as dunnage, should be exempt.
One overall point here is that, prior to the law change in 2009, the default rule for a manufacturer really should have been that their purchases were taxable. You had to clearly show you came within this direct use machinery exemption in order, or an industrial materials exemption in order to say your purchase was exempt. Now I think it's completely the reverse. Now that the associations have been successful in getting consumable supplies in, and the machinery and equipment that's necessary and integral to the process all exempt. I think the energy. I think the default now is you need a very good reason to say that something is subject to tax. Everything should be exempt within the manufacturing plant that's used in the manufacturing plant, unless there's a good reason that it is not. Somehow it is used as office equipment or something else that takes place at the manufacturing plant, but is not actually associated with the manufacturing going on at that location.
Yeah, so we have a couple questions about consumable supplies. One about tape and paper towels used in the administrative offices that may or may not be attached to a manufacturing plant. I think you could look at this in two ways. In one way, there is a substantial purpose test that's in Georgia law that... You go to the next page. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Under the substantial purpose test, you've got items that are used both in an exempt capacity and a non-exempt capacity. And I think a good example of that would be a forklift that is used in the manufacturing process and also in the distribution process, where the manufacturing exemption does not apply unless some other exemption applies to distribution machinery and equipment. Forklifts are used all over the place, and you're going to use whatever forklift is closest to what you need to do. You may not specify, well, this forklift can't pass this line, and only these forklifts can be used over here. So if you're using something in a dual capacity, Georgia actually has some guidance on that, and what the law says, it only has to be used at least a third of the time in an exempt capacity in order for it to be exempt, which is a pretty favorable standard because I think most other states have a predominant test, and so you'd have to show that it's more than 50%. And in fact, Georgia's requirements on proving that are pretty reasonable also. You don't have to keep a log of how many hours the forklift is used here versus there. You could generally use, well, it's used in this much time, but time's not the only way that you could measure things. The statute and the regulation provides that the taxpayer can provide other sort of documentation and other explanations of why they meet that one-third standard. But getting back to the consumable supplies, you could make the argument, I think, that tape or paper towels that you're buying and using in the administrative office under substantial purpose tests, that they are exempt if you use, at least a third of what you're purchasing in the manufacturing plant, and especially if you're purchasing it all together in bulk. You could argue, well, there's not a requirement in the law that if I'm buying large quantities of paper towels and half of them are used in the plant, half are used in the administrative office, that I have to bifurcate that for sales tax purposes. So if you're buying it in bulk, I think you'd have a decent argument. If you're buying them separate, I would say that the department would likely say that those consumable supplies that are used solely in the administrative office, those would probably still be taxable.
Right. I think generally, as a baseline, that those types of tape, paper, towels, things used in the administrative office are actually still subject to tax. But perhaps, as you put it, Jonathan, there's some wiggle room there with respect to large bulk purchases that are both where the property is used in both locations. But I think that if there were substantial amounts at issue, I think that that's kind of the one example of something that in a within the fence line of the manufacturing plant that could still be subject to tax, that type of administrative supply.
Yeah. Now, if you had a tape dispenser with tape that's mobile, that's moving around, and sometimes it's on the manufacturing floor, and sometimes it's in an office, and sometimes it's used for packaging, I would say you go back to the substantial purpose test and show that that tape was used more than a third in exempt capacity, and I think the department would agree with that. But if you're buying separately for the different places, I think it'd be an uphill argument.
Okay. Well, let's address mining and quarrying activities directly for a minute here. Certainly, we mentioned before that the Lee and the association did a great job of making sure that mining and quarrying was included in the list of manufacturers in the original integrated plant regulation. That's actually an issue in some states, whether the mining and quarrying can qualify as manufacturing in other states. But in Georgia, quite clearly, it can, or it is qualified as manufacturing. And the question is kind of when the manufacturing process starts for the mining and quarrying activities. As I mentioned earlier, under prior law, the cases had decided that anything associated with extracting the mineral from the ground was not manufacturing, but the manufacturing began once you took that extracted material and did something with it, like sent it through a rock crusher. That was the first stage of manufacturing. Thankfully, through the Department of Revenue's original regulation, really took that point about when the manufacturing process started for mining and quarrying back further in time. So they did this by listing examples in the regulation. They listed some examples of what mining and quarrying activities were eligible for the exemption, and then listing some that were not. And as listed, those that are exempt are the mining and quarrying activities such as blasting, extraction, and crushing activities. So crushing is not the first manufacturing process; it's back to the blasting and the extraction. So that really was quite favorable for the mining and quarrying industry in Georgia to now have those items exempt from tax. However, the regulation does still provide an example of some mining equipment that would not be exempt from tax, and so it doesn't go back as far as. And generally, the equipment used in site preparation, including the removal and clearing of overburden, is generally not exempt from tax. Department's theory is that has to do with real estate and is not associated with manufacturing the tangible personal property. Note, however, that as Jonathan was describing earlier, that machinery and equipment that's used for both types of activities, the overburden removal, let's say, and also the extracting, if you have tractors and cranes of sort that would participate in both of those activities, if you are able to document and show that at least a third of the use of that equipment or machinery is for the extraction of the mineral as opposed to the removal and clearing of the overburden, then under the substantial purpose test, that machinery would be exempt from tax. So there is some planning to do there in terms of how much certain pieces of equipment at a quarry, for example, should be used in one process or another.
And now we're going to get into some examples of items that are generally exempt and then some items that are generally taxable. And these, we've pulled these pretty much out of the regulation, and the ones that are generally exempt are also in the statute. And I do want to know that these slides will be made available for everyone that's on this webinar, and so we can go back and look at these if we have any questions on these examples of what's generally exempt or taxable, and most of these are also in the regulation as well. And as I go through these, and I'll just pretty much summarize them, you'll see that many, or really most of these, would not have been exempt under the prior direct use standard because they weren't actually exerting force on the product being made, or would have deemed to have been used prior to or after the manufacturing process. But moving into the first example here, under the integrated plant, machinery equipment that's exempt, that's necessary and integral to manufacturing process, is generally now viewed as machinery equipment that's used at the point that raw materials arrive at the docks of the manufacturing plant and to the point that the finished materials move into the distribution process. And so that's a lot broader than, when manufacturing starts and manufacturing ends, because now you add on to the front and back processes that are necessary and integral. And so that would include transportation equipment that takes raw materials arriving at the docks and takes them perhaps to a storage process before manufacturing begins, and then would take them from that storage process to the manufacturing process, and those distribution equipment that would take them from the manufacturing process to the packaging process, and then perhaps from the packaging process to the beginning of the distribution process. Forklifts and conveyors and cranes and hoists and pallet jacks and anything used during that process is going to be exempt. Would also include not only distribution items transportation items within a manufacturing plant, but that could also include transportation items between manufacturing plants. And so if you had manufacturing plants that are close to each other and you've got machines that are transporting materials between the two plants, those would generally be exempt, except if those trucks or other vehicles are required to be registered for over-the-road use. So anything that's required for over-the-road use would fall out of this exemption, but anything else should be exempt, whether it's within the plant or between the plant. Those storage bins and items that are used to heat and cool prepared materials upon arrival at the manufacturing plant, those are clearly exempt. Any machinery equipment used to control, regulate, heat, cool, produce energy that's needed for manufacturing. For instance, if you've got a manufacturing facility, the product can only be manufactured at 40 degrees. You've got machines that regulate the air to make sure that the air is 40 degrees in that facility, assuming that we can show that it's tangible personal property rather than real property. That machinery equipment used to produce those conditions necessary for manufacturing, those should be exempt. We've talked about repair and replacement parts, including liquid repair and replacement parts. Those are exempt as used in machinery. Testing and control equipment used at a manufacturing plant, those are going to be exempt whether they're testing every item that's coming through the manufacturing plant or only testing samples of items. Either way, those are going to be exempt. Electrical components located between a motor control center and exempt machinery and equipment, or between separate units of exempt machinery and equipment, those are going to be exempt. Machinery equipment used to maintain, clean, or repair exempt machinery equipment, those are exempt. Previously, you may have some questions, well, if we're using something to maintain or clean, is it exempt because it's maintaining or cleaning, or is it not exempt because it's a consumable supply? That issue's gone away now. We don't have to figure out whether it's a consumable supply, so it should be exempt. Machinery equipment used to provide safety for employees. Safety equipment, this is one that, going back to 2009, that's always been provided. it didn't matter whether something was a consumable supply or not. So even if it was a consumable supply, such as gloves or a face mask or earplugs, something that was used once and thrown away, those have always been exempt since 2009. We've got a question here regarding safety supplies about water or other fluids used to hydrate workers used in a manufacturing plant, whether that would qualify as safety equipment. I think it's a good question. I would hesitate to say. I would think the department would probably disagree with that. I would think they'd probably say that any sort of food or food product or water used to hydrate would probably not be deemed either a consumable supply. It would probably not be an exempt consumable supply or a safety equipment. You agree with that, Scott?
Well, I think the argument is tough, like you're saying, Jonathan. I think if you were able to point to some type of mandate, governmental mandate, a regulation or statute requiring, certain types of that this be provided to people, doing this particular type of work, I think you would have a better argument. As defined in the statute, as it's always been defined, even prior to the consumable supplies, that safety equipment, was defined to include but not be limited to that safety machinery and equipment required by federal or state law. So, if you could in fact make the argument it's required by federal or state law, I think your argument is better. But these don't know that these will be substantial in amounts or not, but there are certainly issues around the edges, as there always.
And one of the important parts about safety equipment is it doesn't have to be mandated by OSHA or other law. Anything that you deem to be important enough that you're purchasing for safety purposes should be exempt under Georgia law. Just finishing up the list, machinery and equipment used to condition air or water to produce conditions necessary for manufacture of tangible personal property. That would also include machinery and equipment used in pollution control, sanitizing, sterilizing, or recycling processes. And finally on this list is packaging containers are exempt, and those should be exempt whether they're reusable or single-use only. We're going to now go to the list of what's generally taxable, and luckily this is a short list. As Scott mentioned, the presumption today, if you're thinking about a piece of machinery equipment, the presumption should be that it is exempt. But there's still a couple items that would be deemed generally taxable. Consumable supplies are now, they were taxable up to July 1, 2014, but as of today, no longer taxable. I mentioned motor vehicles required to be registered for operation on public highways. Those are still deemed to be taxable, although Scott and I think there are some arguments about motor vehicles and taxability. And particularly, I'm not sure that the issue is even relevant now, because now that Georgia has switched from sales tax on motor vehicles to the title ad valorem tax, there's some different thoughts on that.
Well, I think you're exactly right, Jonathan, that now the motor vehicles would not actually be subject to sales tax, but Georgia has enacted a new tax that applies to registered motor vehicles, their so-called title ad valorem tax, the TAVT. And so manufacturers are going to have to contend with that tax going forward. There won't be an exemption, but it does at least replace the annual property tax on those vehicles.
Finishing up this list, anything that's going to be deemed real property is going to be considered taxable. Storage tanks, containers, racks used to handle, store, or distribute finished goods after completion of the manufacturing process, those are going to be deemed taxable. You were just talking about the distribution process here. There are some other exemptions that you may be able to meet regarding distribution facilities, but that's distinct from the manufacturing exemption. Administrative machinery equipment, if you've got laptops or printers or copiers that are used at a manufacturing plant or in offices that are attached to or located near a manufacturing plant, it's most likely that those will still be taxable. Customer self-service equipment, vending machines type things are still going to be taxable. One that's not on here that's a pretty important one is machinery equipment used in research and development. Those are still deemed to be taxable in Georgia, although this is one item that from a lobbying effort, I think that the organizations may try to approach next year. The reason why R&D equipment is not exempt today is Georgia, if you look in the regulation, there's still a requirement that exempt machinery equipment is used to produce tangible personal property for sale. And so if you're just doing R&D, you don't meet that for sale requirement. So that's why today R&D equipment would still be taxable.
Jonathan, let's handle a couple of questions here that deal with as Jonathan mentioned, the items that are still taxable. Real property is still taxable. So to the extent that you are purchasing concrete to be a slab of foundation, it's subject to tax. The other area, and specifically mentioned in the regulations at this point, is that the heating and cooling systems that are provided for employee comfort are generally subject to tax. But it says that in the context of what is real property and what is not. So to the extent you have fixtures in your the heating and cooling system, the ducts and all that that are not necessary for the manufacturing, but for employee comfort, that would be subject to tax, but only if it's real property. There could be systems that were, fans and whatnot that are for the comfort of the employees that would still be tangible personal property and deemed to be necessary and integral for the manufacturing process.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, energy that's used just for the personal comfort of employees is deemed to be taxable, even though the HVAC system itself may not be.
Okay, well let's switch then to the taxation of energy. This has been another large improvement in Georgia's treatment of manufacturers. Beginning in 2013, the legislature enacted an energy exemption that exempts energy of manufacturers. And it phased it in, the sales tax exemption in over 4 years. You can see on the slide it's phased in over 2013 to 16. There is still a sales tax on energy. There's a 1% tax that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. The exemption does not exempt the energy from the educational sales tax imposed at the local level. That 1% tax that most jurisdictions impose you're not exempt on that energy. The energy is very broadly defined. It's any energy that's used in the manufacturing process to power your machines or otherwise. Natural gas, oil, gasoline, electricity, even solid fuels like wood. If you're burning waste to power your machines, those purchases can be exempt from tax. The one I had given a caveat earlier about energy producers, those power generators that those companies that generate power, electric power for sale, they actually do not benefit from this new sales tax exemption on energy for manufacturers. The energy for this purpose is defined to exclude their purchases of, say, natural gas that's burned in an electric power plant. Those purchases would not get this sales tax exemption, but those producers have always had a separate exemption from sales tax, at least at the state level. So they did not need it for at least for natural gas on use in their facilities. Other types of fuel they are still subject to tax on. So the energy that is exempt from sales tax is energy used for any purpose at a manufacturing plant. It's all considered necessary and integral to the manufacture of tangible personal property. This would obviously include the energy used to operate to power the machinery and equipment at the facility. It's even used to the energy used to, say, heat and cool the manufacturing plant if it's necessary for the production if it's necessary for the manufacturing to create the right conditions on the floor. That is exempt from tax. This is a huge distinction from prior law, where there were cases on point that even the machinery and equipment at a yarn manufacturing facility, even though you have to have the right temperature on the floor to produce that yarn, that still was not used directly and was subject to tax. Here we've clearly exempt the machinery and equipment that produces that, and we even exempt the energy used in that machinery and equipment. Energy that's used as an actual part of the manufacture of tangible personal property, and what we mean here is, going back to that example I used earlier about electrolytic processes. Obviously, if your electricity is being directly shot into the product, that is exempt from tax, but it's much broader than that. Energy used in the administrative or ancillary activities at the manufacturing plant can also be exempt. The kind of large point on audit here is that the department is not requiring that you have a separate metering of the energy. There are lots of states that have energy exemptions for manufacturers, but they draw a very clear line that you have to have energy studies or separate metering of the electricity that's coming into your power plant to measure what is going to the machinery and what is going to some other purpose at the facility. Now, the partly not so great news is that when the legislature in 2012 decided to exempt energy finally from sales tax, they were concerned about the effect on the local jurisdictions. And so they did allow local jurisdictions, primarily counties really are the ones that do this, to enact a separate ordinance, the separate excise tax that would pick up the revenue lost on the exemption from sales tax. And so there are now some counties in this state that are phasing in a separate excise tax on energy, and that applies to manufacturers. It applies to everything that was exempt, that's now exempt from the sales tax under this new provision. It would make it subject to the local excise tax, but not all jurisdictions have enacted this. Certainly they have decisions to make about whether they want to attract manufacturers or not. There are some interesting procedural aspects of this.
Yeah, there's some quirky things about this tax. One, the tax isn't administered by the Georgia Department of Revenue. It has to be administered locally. In fact, the Department of Revenue is quite happy that they don't have to deal with this tax, and if you call them up and ask them a question about the local tax, they will direct you to someone else. They don't deal with this tax at all. It is a tax that is collected by the dealer, and it's collected exclusively by the dealer. There's no provision for a manufacturer to self-accrue use-type tax on this and remit it themselves. And so there's the presumption that the dealer is collecting the tax. In fact, the statute of limitations on this begins at the time that the tax would be due to the dealer if the dealer was collecting the tax. Now, there's some situations where you could have a dealer, and you may think of, well, who's a dealer? Well, probably think of Georgia Power, and in Georgia Power would most likely know which jurisdictions they're required to collect the tax, and when to collect the tax and when to remit it. But there could be dealers out there that are perhaps not sophisticated. They don't know which jurisdictions that they need to collect tax in. Perhaps they're not collecting the tax. There could be dealers, energy dealers, that would say they don't even have nexus with the local jurisdiction, and therefore they're not required to collect tax, such as an out-of-state propane dealer that was just shipping propane tanks into the state. Perhaps they would argue they don't even have a responsibility to collect and remit the tax. But even if you, the manufacturer, even if the dealer doesn't collect tax from you, your statute of limitations, and even if you don't pay the tax your own, because there's no ability right now for a manufacturer to pay the tax on their own, the statute of limitations runs from the point that the tax would have been paid, and if you're past 3 years, the local jurisdiction can't come and collect it from the manufacturer. And in fact, I'm not sure that we're aware that local jurisdictions are planning to audit manufacturers. They're probably most likely going to audit the dealers, the energy providers. But there's that quirky rule that a statute runs whether you paid the tax or filed the return or not. So with that, that's all the prepared materials that we had. We've got a couple outstanding questions that we'll try to answer. And I'll answer the easy ones, and Scott can answer the hard ones. We've got a question about balers used in grocery stores to collect waste, and whether those could be considered exempt under the exemption. I would say possibly. The biggest hurdle that I could see would having to show that where the baler is located is deemed a manufacturing plant, and as Scott indicated, the definition is pretty broad, and so perhaps you could carve out a particular area of a grocery store and deem that a manufacturing plant.
Well, I think also, Jonathan, we're talking about a company that's not itself the grocery store. They're actually using the waste of this grocery store as their raw material or something, so this is collecting their raw material, perhaps.
Right, so you could still try to carve it out.
Right.
You could try. I mean, the retailer itself is not going to be a manufacturer, but perhaps the cardboard company that has these balers at the grocery store, they could try to carve that out as a specific manufacturing facility. So it's possible.
We have several questions about railroads and what about the cost associated with railroads. I mean, one of the issues there, you certainly have items coming in by railroad, raw materials, you have your finished goods leaving by railroad, and I guess you could also have track inside the plant that is associated with moving items around between manufacturing plants or locations at the plant. And I think that there can be very different answers on this because of where the railroad is used. One issue is, of course, whether the railroad track or whatever it is tangible personal property or real estate. It could be an issue, and certainly if it's for the distribution of the product to customers, the department is going to take the position that's like after manufacturing has occurred, even outside the manufacturing plant. But there are, depending on the specific facts of what is done in terms of loading the railroad cars and if there's any and that type of thing, or if it's a direct loading, there can be some available exemptions.
Yeah, I think you go back to the substantial purpose, try to get to the 1/3 requirement, and see if you can meet that. I mean, if you had a railroad that all it did was carry work in process between two manufacturing plants, think you've got a good chance. If you're talking about a railroad that's involved in a lot of distribution, it'd be a lot difficult. I think with that, we're pretty much out of time, but we do provide regular updates on changes in Georgia law. We've got an app for your mobile device that provides updates on not just Georgia law, but state and local tax developments around the country. We've got, on this slide, we show our website and how we can get our app. We're on Twitter, we're on LinkedIn, we're all over the place.
And that app's available at all the app stores for iPhone and Android devices.
Yeah, and we certainly appreciate everyone joining today, and feel free to email or call Scott and I if you have any additional questions.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you for attending the Sutherland webinar, Understanding the Georgia Manufacturing Exemption, hosted by Sutherland attorneys Jonathan Feldman and Scott Wright. Should you have any questions, please contact any of the speakers. Thank you.